newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Well, hello there and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde. My job here is to hold the legacy press accountable, or at least try to point out places where they are being duplicitous or misleading or otherwise trying to steer us in a direction that may or may not actually align with the truth. At any rate, it's good to have you with us. The theme of this episode is Get Them While They're Young. When you see what we're talking about here, you'll understand what that refers to. We'll start with this headline from Idaho Press, and oh my, it looks like somebody is not very happy with the Attorney General. Idaho Health Director files petition against action by Attorney General's office. Now, if you've been following Idaho politics, at least since January, when Attorney General Raul Labrador took office, you understand that he's kind of under fire from a number of people within the bureaucracy. And of course, even people without of the bureaucracy, the people who typically are very statist in their approach, the people who, see freedom and standing up for the rights of the citizens as an impediment to what good government or what I guess government should be doing. They're not concerned whether it's good or not. It's what we have to do. So the story tells us the director of the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare has filed a petition against the Attorney General's office to end a civil demand from the state's top law office. Now, you're going to see that this civil demand is also a request for information. But there's a very good reason why the Attorney General is asking for this information, about $31 million worth of good reasons why he's asking for some accountability. A grant program using federal funds is at the center of the dispute, which has also sparked an audit from the legislative budget writers, as well as another legal dispute between the Attorney General's office and more than 30 nonprofit organizations and school districts. Now, court filings seem to show, okay, this is important, seem to show that previous Attorney General Lawrence Wasden's office had determined the grants were distributed lawfully, while Labrador, the state's current chief legal officer, disagrees. Now, I know it's probably sad to say something like this, but Lawrence Wasden was actually very noteworthy as Attorney General for his willingness to stand up for the bureaucracy and to protect it over the people. Whereas Raul Labrador, if you caught Capital Clarity from the Idaho Freedom Foundation yesterday, has made it very clear when he took office, his main job is to serve the people, the ones who elected him, as opposed to simply rubber stamping or defending the bureaucracy. Moving on in the Idaho Press story, in 2021, the legislature appropriated federal pandemic relief funds with the added requirement that it go toward programs serving school-aged children ages 5 to 13. This is important because the law in Idaho very clearly stipulates this is what this money is to be used for. Now, there have been pointed questions from the legislature as well as the Attorney General Labrador's office asking if some of the grant awardees were ineligible because the funds were put toward preschool and kindergarten readiness programs. Also, in early March, Labrador's office announced that it had served the awardees of a health department grant program with a civil investigative demand. That's a kind of civil subpoena. It's a request for information, okay? It's not a criminal subpoena, but it's asking them to account for this. Show us what you're doing with this money and give us the information that we're seeking so we can determine if this money is being used correctly or not. More than 30 of those organizations filed a motion to either end the civil demands or to extend the deadline on them. That's according to the Idaho Press. Now, look, if they're in the clear, right? If they know that we're not doing anything wrong, we're abiding by the letter of the law, we're doing this as we're supposed to, there should be no reason to extend or ask, please get rid of this. But of course, you're going to see that in this case, the Idaho Press, as well as other mainstream outlets, seem to be carrying water to protect these programs, or at least cast doubt on there should be no reason to look into this. You'll understand more why they are defending these funds and the use of these funds for children that fall outside of those specific or legally specified age parameters. Idaho code requires the Attorney General's office to perform all legal services for the state, including for all agencies. The court filing contends that the office's action against its, quote, client has created adversarial relationship which has generated and will generate entirely unnecessary costs that will ultimately be borne by the people of the state of Idaho in violation of its statutory obligation to represent and advise petitioners. Now, I think the way they're interpreting this is, well, they're saying he should be defending these state agencies at any cost. He should be doing everything he can to whitewash and make legal whatever it is they're doing. So I'm going to go back to what AG Labrador said about who does he work for? He works for the people, not for the bureaucracies. Now, he may represent the bureaucracies when they're being challenged in court, but in this case, he's trying to find out if the bureaucracies themselves are doing something that is beyond what they're supposed to be doing. You know, want to talk about, well, this is going to cost the taxpayers money. Well, if it's the agencies that are doing something wrong, they're the ones costing the taxpayers money, not the person who's trying to determine if there's wrongdoing and put a stop to it. Understood? Labrador's office said the move was not adversarial, but is the office's way of gathering information, and that it's not because it's not a criminal investigation or action. He has statutory authority to look into anyone who might have information about a suspected wrongdoing, meaning the subject to that investigative order is not necessarily the person or organization being investigated. Idaho Attorney General Office spokesperson Beth Cahill wrote in a statement that includes the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare employees who were responsible for dispersing these unlawful grants. A November 30th, 2022 legal memo from the previous Attorney General's office found the department's implementation of the CCDC program does not appear to violate federal and state guidelines. Now, again, this is Lawrence Wasden. This is someone who, this is the guy who kept the case alive for nearly 3 years against Sarah Brady. So is he working for the people or is he working for the state? You can probably figure it out by the fact that he wanted to keep this woman facing criminal charges for refusing to leave a park and daring a police officer to arrest her, which he did. It cites federal guidelines on the funds which emphasize access to child care without regard to age. Well, that's fine what the federal guidelines say, but what does Idaho state law say? You'll find out here in just a moment. State guidelines emphasize serving school-age participants ages 5 to 13 as allowable by federal guidelines and also require the department to ensure that the applications comply with grant guidelines. Now, here you get to see a little bit of sophistry. Read together, the guidelines do not preclude serving children younger than 5 years of age, toward whom federal guidelines are arguably geared, as child care needs lean heavily toward younger children. Rather, the combined guidelines indicate that the applicants should include and not exclude serving children ages 5 to 13. So this seems to be kind of a case of, well, it didn't explicitly say we couldn't do this. It's kind of how some people in the federal government like to interpret the Constitution. Well, it didn't specifically say that we can't spy on you under these circumstances. That what they don't understand is that the guidelines and the law, in this case, outline explicitly what they can do. And anything that they renew, well, it didn't explicitly tell us, no, we couldn't wet our finger and stick it in your ear. It's not a matter of what it doesn't say. It's a matter of what does it say. And are they abiding by that? But they prefer to play the game of, I'm not really touching you. The situation of legal action between an agency head and an elected constitutional, there's a word missing there, official, is unusual. According to former Attorney General Jim Jones. Jim Jones served on the campaign of Labrador's election opponent, Tom Arkush, who was crushed in the election. I'm only going to point that out because that's something that Jones likes to point out about anybody that he's opposing politically. Well, he did lose a race once. It's a clear-cut violation of attorney-client relationship, Jones said, of the civil investigative demands. I can't think of any situation where the Attorney General hauls off and takes action against one of his clients, particularly an agency head and a deputy in office. Now, let me interpret that as it sounds coming across from Jim Jones. He's saying that Raul Labrador, as Attorney General, should be defending the state. End of story, period. He should be defending those state agencies. Whatever they're doing, he should be the one making it right. And, hey, screw the taxpayers, screw the people whose money it is, or the people to whom, this is being applied maybe to their kids. And again, you'll see here in a moment why there's a pretty big question mark hanging over what exactly are these funds being used for? What are these kids being taught in these various programs? You're going to find it's kind of a familiar theme that we're seeing. But that's not his job, is it? He's elected by the people of the state of Idaho And as Attorney General Labrador said, that's who he is looking to represent, is the people of the state of Idaho, making sure its laws are faithfully executed, making sure they're not being skirted or otherwise bent to benefit a few chosen, cronies. Let's take a look at this from a slightly different angle. This is from the Idaho Tribune. Now, look, they don't pull any punches. Kindergate, Idaho Department of Health and Welfare caught misappropriating $30 million tax dollars. Insiders say scandal may lead back to the governor's office. Well, that's a far different spin than what the Idaho Press was saying. But they actually put some details into this story that help you understand why this is a big deal. In 2021, the Idaho legislature passed a bill that allowed for the distribution of money from the Federal American Rescue Plan Act, otherwise known as ARPA funds. The legislature specifically noted in their legislation that the money could be used for school-aged participants ages 5 to 13 years. However, after looking through the list of businesses that received these ARPA funds, you can tell that money was being sent places that it didn't belong. Now, the article goes on to say, according to the Idaho Press, in a guide for applying to the program, the agency said eligible organizations must serve Idaho children ages 5 to 13, and that it was allowable to serve other ages of children within the program, but you must at least serve children in this age range, and funding may not be used for children over 13. Places like Get Ready to Learn Kuna and also Giraffe Laugh, which provide pre-K services for children younger than 5, both received money from community partner grants. In the Get Ready to Learn Kuna application from the 2022 round of grant funding, the explanation for how the entity would amplify its program if awarded the funding includes, quote, "We will scale up our preschool program by opening a 3 to 4-year-old class with full day and extended hours for 16 children." Another grant recipient, the Garden City organization Giraffe Laugh, listed among its goals and outcomes by hiring 15 teachers. Is it 15 or 1.5? I'm having trouble seeing if there's a decimal point there. We will be able to increase enrollment by 20% from the previous year, and more children will be able to access quality early care and education to prepare more children for kindergarten. So this is going to be falling outside that age specification. But when you look into the Wayback Machine, you'll also find that places like Giraffe Laugh are presented as a daycare from 6 weeks to 3rd grade. Not exactly the same age range as stipulated by Idaho law. It's kind of hard to see in the fine print here, but this is from Giraffe Laugh. Giraffe Laugh provides high-quality education for children 6 weeks through 3rd grade. We envision educational justice where every child has an enriched environment to thrive. Wow, did they really use justice? Kind of gives you a little bit of a peek of where they may be headed here. So what kind of activities do places like Giraffe Laugh engage in? Well, let's take a little bit closer look. Right off the bat, it looks like masking. Got to teach them young to make sure that they're wearing the face diaper like good little obedient sheep. Okay, what else? Oh, of course, Pride. Yes, the month of June marks Pride Month, says Giraffe Laugh, a month spent celebrating, supporting, and advocating for our LGBTQ plus community. At Giraffe Laugh, we want you to know you are loved, accepted, and valued. Families may look different, but all families are safe, welcomed, and accepted by us. Now, look, this is something that I think kids, I think they can figure out. Be kind to others without the political agenda that comes along with this. But hey, why not throw a little rainbow-colored baggage at them while we're at it? Again, get them while they're young, train them up to where they are keyed into certain types of justice. In this case, it looks like a little bit of social justice. Hey, speaking of justice, they're also being taught about Black History Month. Look at all those cute little fists in the air. How fun to teach preschoolers. February is Black History Month, a celebration of the achievements, culture, and history of African Americans. Check out this article from National Geographic Kids to learn about how Black History Month started, what it honors, and how it's celebrated today. Lots of hashtags, of course, tying in Giraffe Laugh with it. So again, the point here is, taken by themselves, these are topics that anybody might choose to pursue. But when you're presenting them to kids, suddenly this takes on a very woke flavor. Like, we've got to start these kids thinking very young about things like pride and things about justice and Black Lives Matter and be sure to wear your mask and be sure to do whatever the experts are telling you. And I'm sorry, that is part of the woke agenda. Woke is ubiquitous. And it seems like it's always focused on getting to the kids as young as possible. Now, they also have some interesting fellow travelers. For instance, here is Idaho's Democrat, carbon neutral by 2050 parade marching mayor, Lauren McLean, who in conjunction with the Idaho Association of Young Children gave places like Giraffe Laugh $3 million in 2021. Now, there are other organizations that have given them money too. Oh, let's not forget, they also got the chance to use kids as props for the Idaho Teachers Association. Look at that. Teachers just want to have fun. Oh, it's so cute. Getting the kids involved. I mean, they'd be so angry if it was, a conservative event, if there were American flags waving rather than rainbow flags. How dare people use these children as pawns? Crazy. Well, Anna Miller from the Idaho Freedom Foundation said in an article about the legislation, federal money passes through Boise directly to left-wing groups specializing in left-wing indoctrination for young children. Federal money means adopting the values of the federal government. Now, I know for some people it's like, well, great, those are the values that we want to adopt. For a lot of folks, myself included, those values are increasingly being turned on their heads because they're at odds with reality, as well as at odds with even just the most basic morality, the most common ideas of right and wrong. The Idaho Department of Health and Welfare, says idahotribune.org, disobeyed the legislature when they distributed these funds. Now Idaho's Attorney General has stepped in. 2 weeks ago, AG Labrador's office sent out over 50 subpoenas to groups that received funds from the Community Partnership Grant after the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee voted to investigate the situation. Then the legislature stopped the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare from making any more payments. At that point, here came the innocent child care workers protesting. Oh, they were not happy about that. Who's going to pay for my child's health care, my child's daycare? I thought so. It's not going to be anybody. I mean, is it government's responsibility to pay for that in the first place? I'm sorry. I know there are parents who benefit from it. A lot of parents use public school as their de facto child care. But to expect it, to see it as a given, somebody owes me this, it's a very dangerous entitlement mentality, and it's putting kids right in the hands of people who would love to get their hands on your kids and indoctrinate them into various left-wing ideologies. Idaho Code 18-5702 states any public officer or public employee who misuses public monies in violation of Section 18-5701 Idaho Code is guilty of a felony, punishable by a fine not exceeding $10,000 or by imprisonment in the state prison for not less than 1 year, nor more than 14 years, or by both. Over $30 million of taxpayer funds were misappropriated and distributed to groups like Giraffe Laugh all over the state, in direct contradiction with the guidelines laid out by the legislature in how those funds were to be spent. Now, look, here we have, the teachers and the students, standing up here and trying to I think this is the Joint Finance Committee that they're trying to petition. Hey, we need that money. Don't cut off of this money. This is important to us. Look, nobody's trying to throw kids out on the streets. No one's trying to take their kittens and stomp on them. But the taxpayers deserve accountability for this money. And if someone is being shady or somewhat hinky in how they put it to use, it deserves to be investigated and called out. Oh, and by the way, now notorious rhino Greg Cheney has joined the fight, filing a lawsuit against Idaho's AG to prevent him from investigating the use of these funds. They don't want scrutiny. They don't want Labrador looking into this. Ryan Spoon tweets, "This tells you everything you need to know about this case. Greg Cheney, former Idaho lawmaker and attorney representing the petitioners that filed the motion, said, hey, birds of a feather, man. They're looking out for each other." Now, this is all, of course, a distraction to get everyone looking away from the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare. The woman most immediately responsible for the alleged disbursement of these funds is a woman named Erica Rupp, a program director at the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare. However, according to the Idaho Press, she no longer works for them. In fact, she's been unreachable. Next in line would be David Jeppesen, the politically appointed head of the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare. And the question they ask is, how much did he know about this grant program and who the money was going to? What about Beth Oppenheimer, head of the Idaho Association of Young Children, who tried to spin this situation in the press as though heartless Republicans wanted little kids and cats to starve to death and is taking all their money? But Idaho Tribune points out the truth is that many of these businesses wouldn't exist without these kinds of schemes to get taxpayer money to prop up crappy, woke childcare centers. So I think it's right that they're asking questions. I get that it's inconvenient to those who want to indoctrinate these little minds. But here's a good example of the lengths to which people are willing to go to try to get those germs of left-wing activism started as young as possible. We hear the term groomer thrown around a lot, sometimes correctly, sometimes incorrectly. This is one of the correct uses of groomer. They want to groom these kids into reliable little left-wing activists. All eyes, says the article, should be looking toward the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare and the governor's office to figure out how this massive misappropriation of funds was allowed to take place. And from here, I'm just going to go through these slides pretty quickly, but this is a list of all the recipients of the Community Partner Grant Program from the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare. I mean, look at this. This is a lot of different agencies and different organizations that benefited from this. What do you do in that case? Here's one last slide. Look at all that. I'm going to go back to Anna Miller, and this is an article that she had written back in August of last year, talking about how federal money was essentially coming through Boise and then being given to chosen left-wing organizations. And from that article, she points out lawmakers should defend against this corruption at the local level. Legislators could pass a law prohibiting schools and localities from contracting for teacher professional development, recruitment, child care, curriculum, or consulting with providers who promote the sexualization of children or racially essentialist doctrines like critical race theory. Legislators could cut off the funding the city receives from sales tax revenue sharing. And again, this needs to be said. Federal money means adopting the values of the federal government. Idaho should be different. And Anna Miller says this means forging our own path toward a future without the divisive and sick ideologies everywhere being peddled by the education establishment. I know things like this have a tendency to sometimes devolve into just simply it's a political struggle. The Jim Joneses of the world always look at this in terms of, well, how does this advantage me and disadvantage my opponents in a political sense? I'm trying to look at this from a much more simple aspect, and it's right and wrong. Is this right? Is this the proper role of government, or is it not? And when it comes to that, it also comes with that accountability to taxpayers. Taxpayers don't really have a say in the money that's taken from them for taxation. Sorry, but you're taxed at the threat of, you either give us the money or else. And that or else means men with badges and guns will come and hurt you if you don't do what you are told. So it's hard to paint that as well. It's just strictly a voluntary thing. I'm sure, these taxpayers are totally okay with it. Some are. Some would probably prefer their money didn't go for such things. But when law specifically stipulates, okay, this money can be used under these circumstances, and then you find people skirting it, using their sophistry. Well, it didn't say specifically we couldn't use it for this, but when you see it being mixed in with various woke programs and woke ideologies, it's time to blow the whistle, and it's time to get to the bottom of, okay, who exactly okayed this? I mean, $30 million in the grand scheme of things, when you're talking billions of dollars in the state budget, $30 million doesn't sound like a lot, but it represents an awful lot of blood, sweat, and tears on the part of those taxpayers who actually provided the value and work to earn that money. So out of fairness to them, I think that they are owed the very basic accountability, and I would say, obedience to the law by those who end up using that money. And if they want to use it to try to get them while they're young and get those young kids and start indoctrinating them into left-wing thinking, I wouldn't say that's an appropriate use. And by the way, I would say the same thing if people were trying to indoctrinate them into right-wing thinking. Too many people have this binary view. Well, if it's not left-wing thinking they're being indoctrinated into, then it's right-wing. No, actually, freedom can encompass a lot of different points of view, but the key is who is trying to force one another into thinking or behaving or speaking or acting a certain way. If you're on the side of freedom, you let people make their choices. As long as those choices are peaceful and don't infringe on somebody else's personal and natural rights, more power to them. Anything peaceful should be allowable. But folks on the left and sadly some folks on the right who are infected with that disease of statism feel like, well, we just can't leave things like this to chance. We have to make sure that people are doing the right thing, and that means we've got to force them somehow, and they're only too happy to use government force to make that happen. So let's call out for accountability wherever we can. Let's not immediately assume that, well, the only reason that Raul Labrador is doing this is because he's trying to do favors for his political friends. No, he's actually holding to principle. which I guess is such a foreign concept to so many of these people that they can't imagine that anybody would operate on the idea of principle as opposed to just simply trying to do whatever is politically advantageous. That's a sickness of the soul. And sadly, it's very widespread. It's not just limited to Democrats. As you can see, a lot of Republicans seem to have that as well, especially a lot of Republicans who talk the talk when they're up for election, but then when it comes to governing, they vote right along with their statist counterparts in the Democratic Party, and there's no limit to what they're willing to see government do or the amount of money they're willing to spend simply because it's other people's money. Oh, and then they'll sit back and act like, oh, you owe me a thank you for that. You probably want to shake my hand for all the favors I've done for you. You want me to shake your hand? You want me to tell you thanks for doing me a favor? Get government off my back, lessen its costs, lessen its scope and its reach in my life so that I can make more of my own decisions and live my life as I choose, peacefully. And I'll think about shaking your hand. But until then, no, not going to happen. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
that